I knew my husband was cheating long before he introduced her to me. I knew before he started calling me unstable. Before he told people I was imagining things. Before he decided I was someone he could replace once he no longer needed me. What he didn't know was that I wasn't as dependent as he thought, and that the money he was counting on wasn't his to touch. But that came later. In the beginning, we looked like the kind of couple people trusted. Stable. Practical. Predictable. I worked 2 jobs while he chased a future that never seemed to arrive on schedule. A startup idea that kept changing shape. Courses he needed to finish. Certifications that always required just a little more time. I never complained. I paid the rent. Covered the groceries. Handled emergencies. When he talked about his plans, I listened like they were already real. When he failed, I absorbed the impact quietly. He used to tell people I was supportive. He never mentioned that support was the reason he could afford to fail repeatedly. Somewhere along the way, that turned into entitlement. He stopped asking before spending. Stopped explaining where his time went. Stopped treating me like a partner and started treating me like a safety net. He spoke over me in conversations. Corrected me publicly. Joked about how lost I'd be without him. People laughed. I smiled. I noticed the changes early. The phone angled away from me. The sudden gym sessions that ran late. The way he'd shower immediately after coming home. None of it felt dramatic. Just slightly wrong. I didn't confront him. I waited. Because when someone believes you're powerless, they get careless. That carelessness showed up one evening when he brought her home. Not secretly. Not accidentally. Deliberately. He introduced her like she was harmless. A colleague. A friend. Someone who'd helped him think clearly. She shook my hand and smiled like she was proud of something. Like she already knew where this was heading. That was the moment I understood the story he'd been telling about me. I wasn't his wife anymore. I was the obstacle. What he didn't know was that, a month earlier, my grandmother had passed away. And she had left me everything. Not just money, property. Accounts. Assets that had been in my family longer than my marriage. I hadn't told him yet. Not because I was hiding it. Because I was still processing what it meant. Now I understood exactly what it meant. He started treating me like a temporary inconvenience. Told people we were growing apart. Let his friends believe I was unstable. When I asked where he'd been one night, he laughed and said I was being paranoid. I let him. Behind the scenes, I did something else. I gathered records. Bank statements. Proof of payments. Property documents in my name. Messages he didn't realize were evidence. I stayed quiet while he got bolder. Because silence, when used correctly, is not weakness. It's preparation. He didn't wait long to rewrite the story. Once she existed openly in our lives, he stopped pretending there was anything to explain. Conversations turned dismissive. Questions became accusations. If I asked where he'd been, he'd sigh like I was exhausting. If I asked why he hadn't come home, he'd say I was interrogating him. He started using words carefully, the way people do when they want witnesses later. You're imagining things. You're too sensitive. You've been under a lot of stress. He said these things in front of others. Friends. Colleagues. Even family. He wanted them to hear it. He wanted a record of me being the problem. And I let him. Because once someone decides to destroy you quietly, reacting loudly only helps them. The humiliation didn't come all at once. It came in layers. He stopped introducing me as his wife. Started saying my name instead, casually, like the title no longer applied. At gatherings, he'd leave my side and spend the evening talking to her. Not hiding it. Performing it. She laughed too loudly at his jokes. Touched his arm like it was already familiar territory. People noticed. Some pretended not to. Others watched closely, curious how I'd respond. I didn't give them anything. When someone asked if everything was okay between us, he answered before I could. Told them we were figuring things out. That I was having a hard time adjusting to changes. That I didn't handle uncertainty well. I nodded. I smiled. I played the role he was assigning me. Behind closed doors, he became bolder. He stopped coming home altogether some nights. When he did, he treated the house like a temporary stop. Changed clothes. Took calls outside. Left again. When I asked if he planned to come back, he shrugged and said he needed space. Space, apparently, meant freedom. The irony was almost impressive. He was so busy building a narrative where I was unstable that he never questioned why I wasn't fighting back. He never wondered why I wasn't crying, begging, demanding answers. He took my silence as proof that he was right, that I had nothing to stand on. That's what made the next part possible. He began spending money like it wasn't real. Not extravagantly at first. Just enough to signal confidence. New clothes. Better restaurants. Weekend trips he didn't invite me on. He talked about future plans like I wasn't in the room. Like I wasn't part of the equation anymore. Then came the casual assumptions. He told her about investments he planned to make. About moving somewhere more aligned with his life now. He spoke about my income like it was irrelevant. About the house like it was his to leave behind without consequence. He didn't know that every asset he dismissed had a paper trail that didn't include him. I had inherited more than money. I had inherited patience. While he was busy telling people I was emotional, I was organizing documents. While he was explaining my silence as weakness, I was watching patterns form. His spending. His timelines. His contradictions. I didn't correct him when he told others that I relied on him financially. That lie would age badly. The moment he truly crossed the line came unexpectedly. He invited her to a family gathering. My family gathering. He didn't ask. He informed me. Told me she'd be there because she was important to him now and that avoiding it would prove his point about me being difficult. I agreed. That night, I watched my own marriage be dismantled in public. I watched him stand beside her, comfortable, confident, telling stories that excluded me. I watched relatives glance at me with concern, pity, confusion. She smiled at me across the table like she'd already won. That's when I knew he believed the story was finished. Later that evening, one of his relatives pulled me aside and asked quietly if I was okay. If I needed help. If something had happened between us that they didn't know about. Before I could answer, he stepped in. She's been under a lot of pressure lately, he said. I think she's struggling. I thanked them for their concern. I didn't defend myself. Because defending yourself when someone is lying about you only works if the truth is allowed to exist. And I was preparing to introduce it properly. That night, after everyone left, he didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He told me we needed to redefine things and that I should start preparing for change. He said it gently, like he was doing me a favor. I asked him one question. Are you sure this is how you want to do this? He smiled. Yes, he said. This is best for everyone. He thought the worst thing that could happen to him was my resistance. He never considered my restraint. Because restraint looks like surrender to people who don't understand timing. And timing was about to become very important. He thought the hardest part was over. That was his first real mistake. Once he decided I was no longer his wife, he stopped being careful. He stopped editing himself. He talked freely around me, assuming I wasn't listening or that it no longer mattered if I did. He spoke about the future like it was already settled, like I was a chapter he'd finished reading. He didn't know I had already started writing the next one. The inheritance paperwork was finalized quietly. No announcements. No social media posts. No conversations over dinner. The assets transferred cleanly, accounts, properties, long-term holdings that had been managed conservatively for decades. My grandmother had been precise. She believed in preparation, not luck. Every document came with history, intention, and legal clarity. I read every page twice. I didn't tell him. Not because I was hiding it, but because information is leverage only when the other person doesn't know it exists. Meanwhile, he grew comfortable spending money he assumed would never be questioned. He stopped contributing to household expenses entirely. If I asked, he'd say things like, "Let's not nickel and dime each other," or "I'll handle things later." Later never came. He started making plans that involved selling things that weren't his to sell. Talking about downsizing the house. Mentioning relocation. Telling her they'd look for something better once things were finalized. Finalized, in his mind, meant me stepping aside quietly. I let him believe that. One afternoon, he came home unusually energized. He talked about a new opportunity, an investor who believed in him, someone who might fund his next idea. He didn't notice the irony of saying this to the woman who had already funded years of his failure. He asked me, casually, if I'd be willing to help bridge the gap one last time. I said no. Not sharply. Not emotionally. Just no. The look on his face told me he hadn't expected resistance. He covered it quickly, laughed it off, said he was just asking. But something shifted then. A thin layer of irritation appeared, like a crack in glass. From that moment on, his tone hardened. He stopped pretending to be considerate. Conversations turned transactional. He spoke to me like someone who had overstayed their usefulness. He started pushing timelines, asking when I planned to move out, whether I'd thought about what came next. I asked him the same question back. What do you think comes next? He smiled. Freedom. I nodded. Freedom is a powerful word. It convinces people they don't need to look behind them. Behind the scenes, I met with an attorney. Not a dramatic meeting. Not an emotional one. Just facts. Documents. Timelines. The kind of conversation that doesn't feel personal until it's too late. I explained everything calmly. The years of financial support. The current situation. The inheritance. The gaslighting. The public humiliation. The other woman. My attorney didn't interrupt. When I finished, she leaned back and said something that settled everything. He's about to learn how expensive assumptions are. We discussed options. Divorce. Asset protection. Documentation. Evidence. Not revenge. Resolution. I started saving messages. Logging dates. Recording conversations legally where permitted. I kept screenshots of the way he spoke to me, the way he described me to others when he thought I wouldn't find out. He was careful not to put everything in writing. But careless enough to put enough. The turning point came when he made his second major mistake. He tried to move money. Not mine. Ours. Or what he thought was ours. He assumed shared accounts meant shared permission. He initiated transfers that flagged immediately. Large enough to notice. Sloppy enough to trace. That's when I stopped being passive. Not outwardly. Legally. The accounts were frozen within days. He didn't find out from me. He found out when his card declined in front of her. That moment changed everything. He came home furious, accusing me of sabotage, of being vindictive, of trying to control him. He raised his voice. He demanded explanations. I gave him none. I told him calmly that I had protected what was mine. The word mine unsettled him. He laughed at first, said I was overreacting, said things like, "Don't act like you suddenly have power here." I didn't correct him. Not yet. Because the law was already doing that for me. Within a week, papers were filed. Not aggressively. Precisely. Requests for disclosure. Notices. Boundaries he hadn't seen coming. That's when the tone shifted again. The confidence evaporated. He started calling. Texting. Asking questions he'd never cared to ask before. Wanting meetings. Wanting clarity. He involved her. She sent me messages that tried to sound neutral but weren't. She asked if there was a misunderstanding. If I was doing this out of spite. If we could talk woman to woman. I ignored her. She didn't matter. What mattered was that the narrative he'd built was collapsing under its own weight. People started asking him questions. Not about me. About money. About timing. About why things didn't add up. And for the first time since this started, he looked uncertain. Not scared. Yet. Just aware that something he didn't understand was happening without his permission. And that awareness is the beginning of panic. He didn't panic right away. At first, he tried to regain control the way people always do when they feel it slipping, by pretending nothing was wrong. He joked about the frozen accounts like it was a temporary inconvenience. Told her the bank was being difficult. Told friends it was just paperwork catching up. Told himself he'd fix it once things cooled down. But things didn't cool down. They tightened. The requests from my attorney weren't aggressive, but they were relentless. Financial disclosures. Contribution histories. Proof of ownership. Timelines that didn't match the version of events he'd been repeating so confidently. Each document forced him to confront a reality he'd ignored for years, that most of what he relied on had never been his. He tried to delay. Missed deadlines. Asked for extensions. Claimed confusion. The law doesn't care about confusion. It only cares about facts. And the facts weren't kind to him. He began showing up differently. Less certain. More cautious. He watched what he said around me again, as if suddenly remembering that words mattered. He stopped raising his voice. Started asking questions instead. Wanted to understand where I was coming from. That shift told me everything. The narrative had broken. He couldn't tell people I was unstable anymore, because stability is difficult to fake when court filings exist. He couldn't describe me as dependent, because dependency leaves a financial footprint, and mine didn't match his story. People noticed. Friends who had quietly accepted his version of events started pulling back. Conversations became awkward. Invitations slowed. He could feel the air changing, even if he didn't yet understand why. She felt it too. Her messages stopped being confident. They became cautious. Then anxious. She asked him what was happening. Why things were taking so long. Why plans were suddenly on hold. Why he seemed distracted every time money came up. He reassured her. He always reassured her. But reassurance without resources doesn't last. The first real crack came when his lawyer sat him down and explained the situation plainly. Not emotionally. Not judgmentally. Just clearly. He was exposed. Years of financial dependence masked his partnership. Assets he'd assumed were shared that legally weren't. Contributions he couldn't prove. Claims he couldn't support. And on the other side of the table, someone who had done everything quietly, correctly, and on record. That someone was me. The divorce filing came shortly after. I didn't serve it dramatically. I didn't announce it. He received it the way these things are meant to be received, professionally, unemotionally, with enough information to remove any illusion of surprise. He stared at the papers for a long time. Then he looked at me and said something that finally revealed the core of the problem. You planned this. I didn't deny it. I corrected him. I prepared for it. There's a difference. Planning implies malice. Preparation implies awareness. He tried to negotiate privately after that. Asked if we could handle this without making things worse. Offered compromises that favored him heavily. Suggested settlements that assumed I wanted peace more than fairness. He misunderstood something fundamental. I didn't want revenge. I wanted accuracy. The legal process moved forward regardless of his comfort. Discovery revealed what I already knew. The money trail. The imbalance. The risk he'd created for himself by assuming I wouldn't act. She began distancing herself then. Not publicly. Not yet. But subtly. Fewer appearances together. Less visible support. She stopped posting photos. Stopped tagging him. Stopped speaking about the future like it was guaranteed. People who attach themselves to confidence don't stay when confidence erodes. He noticed. He asked her directly if she was worried. She said she was just giving him space. Space, it turned out, meant reconsideration. The court dates were set. Deadlines established. And with every passing week, the story he'd told people became harder to maintain. He started reaching out to me again. Not angrily this time. Carefully. Asking if there was anything we could do to resolve things faster. If I was open to discussion. If we could meet without attorneys present. I declined. Not out of spite. But because once professionals are involved, personal conversations only create confusion. He wasn't used to that. He was used to talking his way out of situations. Reframing. Softening. Redirecting. None of that worked here. This system didn't care how charming he was. It cared how correct he was. And correctness was not on his side. The day before one of the hearings, he came home and sat across from me like he used to, years ago, when we still believed conversation could solve everything. He asked me why I hadn't told him about the inheritance. I told him the truth. Because by the time it mattered, I already knew who you were. That was the moment he understood something he couldn't undo. He hadn't lost me because of the law. He'd lost me long before that. The law was just documenting it. By the time we walked into court, the story no longer belonged to him. It belonged to records, timelines, and the quiet weight of facts that don't bend for charm or excuses. He sat a few seats away from me, dressed carefully, posture stiff, eyes alert in the way people get when they're trying to anticipate damage. She wasn't there. That absence said more than any statement could have. The proceedings were methodical. No raised voices. No dramatic accusations. Just questions asked and answered with documents that had been prepared weeks in advance. My attorney spoke clearly, without embellishment. She didn't need to convince anyone of anything. The numbers did that on their own. Years of contribution. Years of imbalance. Years of assumption. When the inheritance was introduced into the record, I felt the shift in the room. Not shock, recognition. Assets that predated the marriage. Properties in my name. Accounts that had never included him. The foundation he thought he was standing on simply wasn't there. His attorney tried to argue intent. Partnership. Implied ownership. But implication doesn't survive documentation. And partnership requires contribution, not consumption. He watched as each attempt to minimize my role collapsed under evidence he hadn't known existed. He glanced back once, searching my face for something, anger, maybe. Satisfaction. I gave him neither. I wasn't there to win emotionally. I was there to conclude something. When the judge spoke, it wasn't with judgment or sympathy. It was with finality. Assets clarified. Claims dismissed. Boundaries established. The ruling didn't punish him. It corrected him. And correction hurts people who built their identity on being right. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different. Lighter. Cleaner. Conversations that had once been whispered were now open. People he'd leaned on avoided eye contact. A few nodded politely at me. One or two approached quietly to say they were sorry, for believing him, for not asking questions sooner. I thanked them and moved on. Apologies are easier to offer once consequences arrive. The fallout didn't take long. Within days, his professional circle changed. Opportunities dried up. The investor he'd been so confident about stopped returning calls. Projects he'd spoken about vanished. It's difficult to sell ambition when credibility is in question. Her distance became official shortly after. She didn't announce anything. She didn't need to. She simply stopped appearing. Her social media shifted. Photos removed. Tags disappeared. The version of the future she'd attached herself to no longer existed. He noticed too late. He called me that night. Not angry. Not accusatory. Just tired. He asked if we could talk. I said no. Not because I wanted him to suffer, but because conversation implies possibility. And there was none left. The days that followed were quiet in the way that only comes after something irreversible. He moved out without drama. Collected what he could. Left behind what no longer mattered to him. I watched from a distance, detached, as if observing the end of a long experiment. Friends who had once gathered around him stopped calling. Invitations ceased. The narrative he'd controlled unraveled quickly once he wasn't there to maintain it. I heard through others that he tried to explain. That he framed the court's decision as unfair. That he said I'd changed, that money had made me cold. Money hadn't made me cold. Clarity had. He reached out again a week later. A message this time. Longer. Apologetic in places. Defensive in others. He said he hadn't meant for things to go this far. That he'd felt trapped. That he hadn't realized what he was risking. I read it once. Then I deleted it. Explanations offered after exposure are rarely about truth. They're about damage control. The last thing I heard about her came from someone who didn't mean to gossip. They said she'd been asking questions. About me. About the ruling. About whether things could be reversed. They said she looked scared, like someone who had boarded a train without checking the destination. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing that. I felt confirmation. The version of life they'd planned depended entirely on something that was never theirs to begin with. And when that illusion disappeared, so did the confidence, the loyalty, the future they'd rehearsed so publicly. For me, the silence that followed was the real ending. No more explaining. No more waiting. No more being framed as something I wasn't. Just space. And in that space, something unexpected happened. I felt steady. Not triumphant. Not vindicated. Just steady in a way I hadn't felt in years. As if I had finally returned to myself after living in someone else's shadow for too long. I didn't post about it. I didn't announce a new chapter. I didn't need to. Some conclusions don't require witnesses. They only require distance. The silence after everything settled was louder than the chaos that came before it. For a while, nothing happened. No messages. No legal notices. No third-party attempts to intervene. Just days that passed without disruption. I adjusted to that quiet carefully, the way you do when you've lived in noise for too long and aren't sure if it's truly gone. Then the attempts began again. Not immediately from him. From others. A mutual friend reached out first, asking if I was really done or just taking time to cool off. A family member followed, wondering if I would consider meeting him for closure. Someone else framed it as concern, saying he wasn't doing well and that I'd always been the one who grounded him. That part almost made me smile. I hadn't grounded him. I had carried him. And I had finally put the weight down. When he reached out directly, it was different from before. There was no defensiveness left. No bargaining. Just exhaustion. He said he'd made mistakes. That he'd underestimated me. That he hadn't understood what he had until it was gone. That last sentence was familiar. People often realize value only after it stops being available. He asked if we could meet, not to fix things, but to talk like adults. To end things properly. He said he needed to hear it from me. That he couldn't move forward without understanding where it went wrong. I didn't respond. Because the truth was, he already knew where it went wrong. He just didn't like the answer. When that didn't work, the tone shifted again. Not to anger, but to vulnerability. He spoke about loneliness. About nights that felt too quiet. About how quickly people disappeared when he had nothing to offer them. He was finally describing the experience he'd created for me. Still, I said nothing. She tried next. Not boldly. Not directly. She reached out through someone I barely spoke to anymore, asking if I'd be willing to clear the air. She wanted to explain herself. To apologize. To make sure there were no misunderstandings left unresolved. I declined without comment. There was nothing to resolve. What she'd done hadn't been accidental. It had been opportunistic. And opportunities disappear when they're exposed. I heard later that she'd tried to convince him to reach out one more time. That she believed I was being unreasonable. That if I truly didn't care anymore, I'd have no problem speaking to them. That logic never makes sense to people who confuse access with entitlement. Weeks passed. Then months. His life continued shrinking quietly. Not dramatically enough for headlines. Just enough to feel it daily. A smaller apartment. Fewer contacts. Work that didn't excite him anymore. A routine that lacked the audience he once relied on. He ran into someone I knew at a coffee shop one afternoon. They told me later that he looked different. Thinner. Older. Less certain. He asked about me casually, like he didn't care, like it was just curiosity. It wasn't. I didn't feel the urge to check on him. Not out of cruelty, but because detachment had settled in fully. He had become someone I used to know, not someone I needed updates about. That was when I realized the story had truly ended for me. I wasn't measuring my progress against his failures anymore. I wasn't waiting for an apology that would finally sound sincere. I wasn't hoping for regret to reach a certain intensity. I was already gone. My life had filled in around the absence naturally. Work stabilized. Friendships deepened. I moved into one of the properties I'd inherited and made it my own slowly, intentionally. No dramatic renovations. No symbolic gestures. Just choices that felt right. I didn't rush into anything new. I didn't need distraction. When I eventually met someone else, it wasn't in contrast to him. It wasn't about replacement. It was about compatibility. About ease. About conversations that didn't require explanation or defense. He didn't know my story in detail. He didn't need to. What mattered was that I wasn't performing anymore. I wasn't proving resilience or strength or independence. I was simply living without resistance. The last message I ever received about my ex came unexpectedly. Someone mentioned that he'd asked if I was happy. That he'd said he hoped I was. That he regretted how everything ended. Regret is a strange thing. It doesn't ask permission. It arrives when there's nothing left to fix. I didn't feel anything hearing that. No anger. No satisfaction. No sadness. Just distance. Distance isn't coldness. It's resolution. And resolution is what finally allows you to step forward without looking back. Time has a way of shrinking things that once felt enormous. What used to occupy every corner of my mind now feels distant, like a story I heard a long time ago and no longer need to revisit. I don't replay conversations. I don't imagine alternate endings. I don't wonder what I could have done differently. The answers stopped mattering once I stopped needing permission to move on. The life I live now isn't loud. It isn't designed to prove anything. It's steady. Predictable in the best way. Built on choices that don't require justification. On relationships that don't ask me to disappear in order to survive. I learned something important through all of this. Silence is not weakness. Patience is not surrender. And walking away without explaining yourself is sometimes the strongest decision you can make. I don't wish him harm. I don't wish her regret. What they carry is already heavy enough. What I carry now is lighter, and that difference matters. Some endings don't need closure conversations or final confrontations. They end the moment you stop participating. That was my ending. And if you stayed with this story until the end, thank you for listening. If you enjoy calm, real-life stories about choices, consequences, and quiet strength, consider subscribing to the channel. More stories are coming, and I'll see you in the next one.